episode number 120. Head on over to dadhackers.us/120 to get all the show notes and resources. What's up, Dad Hackers? My name is Patrick Antonucci, and I am the host and founder of this podcast and community of Dad Hackers. Well, Dad Hackers is a community of Christian fathers who are devoted to encouraging, equipping, and enabling one another to become the men that God has created and called us to be, so that we can raise up the next generation of fully devoted followers of Christ and leave a legacy of multi-generational faithfulness. Now, on this show, we primarily interview Christian men to dive deep into their experiences and insights into what it means to be a Christian man, a Christian husband, a Christian father, and a Christian leader. We ask questions that dig deep into the thinking and rationale and experiences of these men so that we can all learn and grow into the men that God is calling us to be. I'm so thankful that you've joined us today. Make sure you subscribe so that you never miss any of our value-packed episodes. Also, please make sure you leave an honest review if you're listening to this in iTunes or any other platform that takes reviews. Reviews boost the show's ratings, which means that more dads are going to come across our show and benefit from the content that we put out. I also wanted to let you know that we do have a free private Facebook group just for Christian dads. So after the show, make sure you hop on over to the show notes. There's a link for that in there as well. Morgan, what's going on, brother?
Hey, good to be with you, Patrick.
Right on, man. I'm excited for this. How are you doing today, man?
I'm well. My son just had his wisdom teeth removed this morning. Nice. And we put him in bed and he was loopy and it was delightful. He kept telling us his tongue fell out of his mouth. So another moment of initiation for my 15 turning 16-year-old son and his second surgery. And so, yeah, it's a good day when you just see your son engage in New Frontier and realize we're first-time parents too, right? I mean, how often I have to turn to my 15-year-old and say, we're new at this. Like, I've never been a parent to a 15-year-old before. So we're learning together. So today's a good day. Yeah, it's good.
That's funny because my oldest just turned 13 in December. And so now we're entering the teen years. And it's the same experience. I've never been the father of a 13-year-old. My daughter just turned 12 at the end of last month. So she's getting there. And my other daughter, she's 10 at this time. And so we just have a whole bunch of good new experiences going on.
Yes.
And,
well, Patrick, it's so hopeful to think about actually this category, and this may not be where we're going, but just while we're here, is that when we have a father-centered view of reality, that becomes a position of strength rather than a place of weakness where we fundamentally operate out of shame and fear. I remember being around a handful of healthy men when I was a very young man for the first time in my journey. I never had Christianity modeled for me and a life in God, a real walk with God. And I remember the fear, the longing to one day dream about being a husband and a father, and the fear of how can I offer what I don't have. I remember, and I couldn't even put words to it. And it was fundamentally out of a belief that I was an orphan, that life is up to me on my own. I am on my own. If anything good is going to happen, I have to make it happen. And so the shift when we come home as a son to our father, the story you just illuminated with your children and my son, it's not up to us. And so we can come to them in strength saying, we both have a father and we are being fathered and I'm learning and we can do this together. And it's just such a fundamentally different view of reality and brings such different fruit.
I don't know, man. A lot of deep stuff. We could go all kinds of places there. I want to circle back to that, but I want to kind of get your introduction so that guys that don't know who you are can get a context for where you're coming from and who you are. And just so the listeners know, and you could speak more to this in a little bit. When I had John Eldridge on the podcast, he highly recommended you to reach out to you to come on the show, and that's how you ended up here. So I mean, and you're closely linked with him. So yeah, just tell us some context, because I'd really like to come back to this father-centered view of reality, and also this orphan versus son mentality that we tend to live by.
Yeah, Patrick, I think if I rewind the clock, I had a pretty radical conversion in my college years. So I didn't grow up in a Christ-centered home, didn't have any concept of walking with God. And really, I came to the end of my own personal reserves. Life was really about me, and I had succeeded in many ways, all in the name of self-promotion, a wounded boy looking to find love and validation. And I couldn't put words to it at the time, but I was searching. I came to Christ, and then I heard about this leadership program out in Colorado, and I just graduated from college, but I knew I wanted to become a man. I knew I needed to become wholehearted, and I couldn't have found the terms at the time, but that's where I met John. He was a professor, and he laid out the gospel, a gospel finally big enough to contain all of the longings, particularly as a man, all of the sorrow, all of the dreams, all of the mystery. There was room to walk with God as a man. But when I met John, I was young. And though I was passionate about my faith, what I would say was I was a boy in a man's body, and I was very uninitiated. And so John, I met him right after Brent Curtis died. They wrote The Sacred Romance together. That was John's best friend. And he was in a pretty vulnerable place, and he took a real risk to stay open to relationship. And he brought me under his wing and just said, hey, come with me. And I began asking him questions about life and love and the masculine journey. And that was 22 years ago. And we began Wild at Heart boot camps together. And so I started hauling water and carrying bags and taking a lower seat at the table of a time of initiation, a time of training. And so for the last 22 years, we've journeyed together. Him as an older brother of sorts, going after the hearts of men all around the world, but first and foremost, going after our own hearts and to be restored, and our hearts for each other to live in community.
Wow, that's an amazing testimony and a great story. Talk to me a little bit more about this initiation, and where I'm coming from with this is a lot of guys who are in the situation we found ourselves in. Our fathers were not spiritual mentors to us. They didn't father us from a position of fathering us from the father heart of God. And I think it's very important that we seek out relationship with other men who are older, perhaps more mature in the faith, who can give us that validation and that initiation into manhood that we crave, that we didn't get from our fathers. Does that make sense? Can you speak more to that?
Sure. It was said of Winston Churchill that no one became more of what he did not have. I mean, it's one of the most compelling compliments I could ever think of, that because of God's father-centered heart towards us, that we were born into relationship. We were born from the Holy Trinity, a Father, a Son, the Holy Spirit. We were born out of relationship, and that God chooses to see himself as our Father, that his primary mission is initiating us into wholehearted masculinity. That's what God is up to. And he entrusts some of it to our Father, but he entrusts many pieces to other people as well. And so what I would suggest, Patrick, is whatever a man's story is with his relationship with his father, his earthly father, it's insufficient. So long as we're looking to a man to be what our hearts long for from Father, we will be disappointed. But when we come to risk opening ourselves to God as Father, what happens, Patrick, is so much more opportunity becomes available. We begin to see with the eyes of the heart that God is fathering us in all sorts of way, through people, places, things, expected and unexpected. It even equips us to deal with the disappointment when a man lets us down, whether it's our earthly father or another man. And I can tell you the story of seeking out mentors and seeking out older, wiser men that have taken the road before me. There's immense fruit and there's immense victory. And there's also a lot of wounding, because the boy is so desperate for a father, we will attach ourselves. And so what I want to say is it's essential to look to older men, to men in front of us with more miles on the odometer, but only in first looking to God as the Father and the true caretaker of our soul.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm glad you explained it like that, because I think it's very important to be in relationship with other men, but with that disclaimer that, yeah, they're imperfect. They're probably going to let you down in one way, shape, or form or another. But they can aid you on your journey to getting back to God and to seeing him as Father. And if they've taken some steps toward that they can help guide you on that path a little bit more and maybe get to him faster, if you will.
Right.
I think that's great. So can you explain or talk a little bit more about maybe the impact that John or some other men had on you and how they maybe ushered you toward the Father Heart of God in that process?
Yeah, I think what I would say, Patrick, is it began with two things. One was an ache and the other was a longing. I am a passionate person and I'm a life seeker, right? I'm a hedonist. I want life and I will not stop until I find it. Tozer says that curiosity is the sign of an alive soul. And I think I can say I'm very curious, but I was also very broken. And what I found is that the external didn't match the internal. So I was succeeding in ways. And if you would have seen my life as an iceberg, the 10% above the waterline, it was pretty impressive, right? I had a meaningful career and going after the hearts of men and 2 young children and a wife. But below was fear, doubt, question, is this the path? Why am I not happier? And so I knew that I needed to find the ancient path. And I began asking God questions like, where is the path to life? What is the most important thing? And for a couple of weeks, I heard silence. And then I was persistent. And then I sensed God eventually over time, as I settled in, he said, I want to speak to that, but I'm going to do it through older men. And so make a list of the older men you know, the wiser men you know, someone that maybe not across the board, but in some piece you could learn something from, and come with a student's posture, with a beginner's mind. And so I began to write handwritten letters to men of, hey, what's the most important thing? What are the pitfalls of a young man's journey? What does initiation look like? And over time, those men began to respond. And it was bumpy and it was messy, but sometimes it was a letter from far away. Sometimes it was a cigar over a campfire. But as I listened to their counsel slowly and steadily, what emerged was not something new, but newly recovered. You know, Chesterton says that the gospel, this path to life, is lost by every generation. And it's every generation's charge to aid in its recovery. And so what I found, Patrick, is they were ahead of me. They were Jeremiah 6, right? At the ancient path, at the crossroads. Stand and look where the good way lies, the place for rest in your soul. And I noticed the effect of being around those men. The fruit was I'd walk away from that conversation. The load would feel lighter. I would feel more hopeful. I would slow my cadence. And no circumstance changed, but something like wealth transpired. And so I began asking questions. I think that's the best way to respond, is I took my exclamation points that young men have on most of their ideas. And in humility, I began even trying to find the questions I didn't know to ask. And I began to look for God through those men.
So you said that you felt like God was telling you to make a list of these older men. And that that's an interesting concept to me, because some people say that they hear God speak audibly to them. Other people have this sense in them. And I think a lot of guys are in a place where they're not maybe sensitive to the promptings of the Spirit or hearing from God. Trying to figure out how to even phrase this question. Like, how did you hear from God? How did you know it was him? And how did you know he was like, make a list of men?
Yeah.
You know
no, it's good. Right. Well, I'm looking back 22 years, right? So hindsight has a way of clarifying things for us, where at the time, right? Time and prayer can bring much goodness in our life. But we want things quick, cheap, and easy. And masculine initiation does not happen quickly. It does not happen easily. It does not happen with a very small price tag. But it works, and it brings life, and it brings joy. So what I want to say is, as a young man, even though so much still was wounded in me and uninitiated, when I consented to God, I chose to risk a fundamental belief that God speaks. John chapter 8 says, those who belong to God hear what God says. And so if I believe the rest of the book, then I have to take a risk believing that that's true. And so I start with the belief, God, I am risking believing that you're speaking. And seeing is not believing. Believing is seeing. Right? We see things not as they are. We see things as we are. And so it was only as I chose to risk believing, what if God was a loving father? What if I actually was born into a God-initiated world, a God-breathed world, a God-bathed world where all things are permeated with the presence and power of God? What if God was speaking and my job was to respond? And so with the eyes of the heart, I began to watch the text of my life. God comes disguised as our life. You know, this morning I was up diving into my work, but my son had surgery for his wisdom teeth. And on a practicality, Sherry, my wife, was going to take him with my daughter, Abigail. But I was up there, and as I prayed for my day, I just had a sense of stop the work, gather the family, and lay hands on my son for his surgery. Now you have to understand, my son's had surgery twice, and the first time I was the only one with him. And so we've never, as a family, ever laid hands on a sick person in our family that they would be restored to life. Like, it was a first time, but my sense was, take the risk. I think this is God. I think he's prompting me. So for me to say, God said, go pray for your son, that's a little, I would even say arrogant, because I don't have that crystal clarity. But what I can say is I had a nudging towards it. I took a risk to live in such a way where God has to show up. And the fruit, Jesus says, you'll know it by its fruit. Well, the fruit of us praying for my son was really formative for our family. And as we were praying for my son, right in the middle, it's funny because this just happened today and I've not shared this with anyone, but as we were praying, I sensed the Father's affection and his smile on me saying, you know what's happening right now? When your kids have their kids going into surgery, they'll remember this moment somewhere in their soul. It's forming them. And so it's an example of initiation. It's an example of hearing from God. It's an example of risk-taking, and masculinity is always synonymous with risk. So it's nuanced, it's foggy, it's not always crystal clear, but we need to learn to trust that God he's in the business of speaking to us. The issue is not his speaking. The issue is with our inability to hear.
Yeah, in a personal story, from my point of view, this kind of happened to me. You know how people will say, they'll tell you something in their life and you say, oh yeah, I'll pray for you. And then whether you do or not, I don't know. A lot of times people completely forget about it and end up never praying for them. So I was thinking about this and I thought, well, why not pray for them right there? Take 30 seconds. Yep. How long is that going to take?
Yep.
So is it Walmart? And this is a couple months ago, several months ago, maybe over the last summer. And I saw a guy that used to attend our church. He had been around for a while, and his wife had been sick. And I asked how he was doing and how she was doing. And he said she had passed away. I had no idea. I felt terrible, just even bringing it up, because it was very recent at that time. And I had this sense, you should pray for him. And I said, Chuck, let me pray for you. So I put my hand on his shoulder and prayed for him, and he thanked me. He went into the store, and I went back into my car. And I felt like I was being obedient to God in that moment. But I also had two of my kids in the van, and they saw me do that. And that speaks to what you were talking about how your kids see you take that risk, obey God in the moment. And that has a very big impact on them in shaping them and forming them and molding them.
Absolutely. Because what you did in Walmart in that moment, first of all, I just want to reflect back to you. Well done. Well done on so many levels. Well done on just risking that, following that prompting, because it's vulnerable, right? It may be awkward.
It is.
You don't know how it's going to go, right?
But somebody might see you do it.
Exactly. He might be offended. Who knows? Or exposed, right? But masculinity is always synonymous with risk. And the brilliance of what you just described, Patrick, is so fundamentally in our parenting and our initiating our children is modeling and then providing them direct access. And so much of my life right now is asking myself the question, how am I modeling a life lived in God's kingdom that's attractive, that's life, that someday when they're 30 or 40 or 70, they'll look back and they will have been formed by a life that had a eternal quality, that had something attractive. And if the Christianity we're offering our kids is not more alluring or attractive than their video games or their social media, then it's a pretty small story, because it's intended to be the largest story in which every other story finds its home. And so what is the Christianity that I'm modeling? And children just have a very clear life meter, right? They know life and they know death. And that's why Jesus loved the children, because they weren't operating out of their pose yet. And so how are you modeling? And then how are you giving them access? And so your kids got to see something brilliant. And then the next step is you invite them in to do it themselves. They have a father, right? They have God. And so you will see them intervening by God's grace for their friends. And when a moment, and I've got, my kids are a little bit older than yours. And so it's just really fun to watch, even though it doesn't always feel like it, even though, man, you know, there's a lot of wasted ammo and you miss the target a ton. It's always sowing seed. It's always sowing seed. And when we model and then give them direct access over time, we give them the greatest gift they can ever have, is their own intimacy with God being made available to them if they so choose it.
All right, guys, wanted to take a quick second to tell you about the Iron Men Mastermind. If you're looking for a band of brothers that you can lock shields with, that can go to battle with you in the day-to-day life, who are also in the trenches going through the same struggles and the same challenges that you are going through, I suggest you check out the Iron Men Mastermind. This mastermind was developed and designed for Christian men to help us become the men that God has created and called us to be. And it's designed to help us increase our relationship with God, increase our relationship with our wives, increase our relationship with our children, and begin to provide better for them financially, spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, relationally, in all of those areas, those things that wake you up in the middle of the night. These are the kinds of things that we work on. These are the kinds of ways that we can help you out in the Iron Man Mastermind. If this is something that is of interest to you, you may want to join the Iron Man community, and you can check out more information at dadhackers.us/Ironmen, one word, Iron Men there. All right, now back to our show. Can you speak more to this idea of providing direct access with your kids? What exactly are you speaking about there?
Yeah, this is so core to masculinity, and we could talk a long time on it, but fundamentally, we live in an unprecedented age in history, and has nothing to do with COVID-19. It has to do with our hour on the earth. If we could back up and look at all of human history, what we would find is we are in a very unique window, like 1% of the human experience, and that's conservative. The world has looked something like this, in a world of exponential growth, progress, exponential rate of change. And so something happened around the 1700s, and that was the birth of the combustion engine. And fundamentally what happened was everything skyrocketed, right? We had this development, and whereas our great-great-grandfather's life and his great-grandfather's life were rather similar. Okay, there wasn't much change from generation to generation. And so that's some backdrop to say we live in a very unique age, and it's an information age, right? It's a time of just more and more, faster and faster. And what happens to masculinity in that, several things, but fundamentally we become a specialist. So we gravitate towards a small set of skills where we operate with an exchange, where we take money in exchange for a certain set of skills, and we use that money to buy other things we need. Okay, that wasn't the case for over 99% of human history. A man fundamentally had to know a little bit about a lot of things. He had to be what I would name a generalist. He had to be fundamentally developed and matured as a man, those universal things in which every man shares in common. And it was from that foundation that then he's intended to become the unique man that God has intended him to be, right? That specialist craftsman, but seated on a foundation, okay? And so what I want to get to in that is simply this idea. So much of what we find in an adult man is an uninitiated boy. There are parts of our soul that have gone to sleep. If you've ever broken an arm and it gets casted, the bone heals, but when it comes out, the muscles are atrophied. And most men, if you walk into Walmart or the DMV, what you can assess is there's big parts of what God meant when he meant them as a man that have become very atrophied. They need to be recovered, resuscitated, strengthened. So take a man that's really killing it on the golf course or the boardroom, right? A rich guy that has his stuff together in fancy places, and then his car breaks down. And the tow truck driver comes and he goes, "What do you think's wrong with it?" And the guy's terrified, right? "I don't know what the hell's wrong with it. It just stopped working," right? Fear. Now take another guy that's really good with tools and put him at a 5-star meal with 3 forks and 2 spoons and a menu of words that aren't obviously from his drinking hole. Fear, discomfort, awkwardness, right?
Yeah.
What I'm describing is every man has places in his masculinity where he feels incompetent, where he feels fear, where he feels uninitiated. And it's these places that every one of us has to engage in as our spiritual frontier that are intended to be the place where we participate with God, respond to his fathering, respond to his initiation, so that when you meet us as men, when we mature, what you see is a wholehearted man, a man that's fully masculine as God intended, not a caricature, but a man that can handle a tool, handle a weapon, handle a woman's heart with integrity. And it's from that foundation that then we can ask the certain particular questions of what's my calling, what's my unique offering in the world. But before a man can fix a toilet, it's a very dangerous question to ask of what's my unique place in the world.
That's some deep stuff, man. I think you put into words there some things that I've been feeling in my soul for a long time, as far as, like you said, and I'm going to paraphrase, in some contexts, in some situations, you feel like a little boy in a man's suit.
Yeah.
And have no idea what you're doing.
Right. Okay.
Terrified.
So Patrick, let me pause you right there. Tell me two specifics. Tell me a place where you feel strong, and tell me a place where the boy in you goes, oh crap. Can you give an example?
Yeah. So one place I feel strong is I teach high school math. It's like all the way up to AP calculus. And so I'm very proficient at it at that level, not like doctorate level, of course. But so I can pretty much walk into almost any high school math class and just start teaching it and handle any question that people would pose at me. But I think an area where I would feel kind of small is confrontation with other men. So, and I was talking about this, I made a post about this. I had to confront my next door neighbor, who is an older man. He's old enough probably to be my father. And it terrified me. I had anxiety for 2 days about confronting this guy. It was just yard work type stuff, but I had to talk to him about it, and I was terrified. I felt like a tiny little boy approaching a giant.
Yes.
I still did it, but I mean, what drove me to do it was to get rid of the anxiety that I was feeling over doing it. You know what I'm saying?
Yes. Okay. Now let me reflect back a few things. First of all, well done. You did it. Okay.
Thank you.
You did it. And yeah, the motives are mixed, right? You want to get the anxiety off, but I suggest, Patrick, of just the nature of your work, when your eyes light up, this work you're doing, dad hackers, of going after hearts, you were willing to take a risk. You were willing to take a risk because some parts of you have learned that's a risk worth taking. Okay. You're also a man that's become increasingly self-aware of the internal landscape of your soul, which is essential to masculine maturity, to wholeheartedness, but very few men are willing to engage. And so I want to reflect back, well done. And now what I also want to say is most men never get there. Most men will achieve a high competency and stay in that expertise. And they simply will avoid places where they would feel exposed, right? Most older men arrange for a life that maximizes security, maximizes comfort, and requires that I don't have to change, right? It does not require any change. Brene Brown, I love her term. She calls it engineering smallness. We're brilliant at it. It's just such a masculine indictment, right? Engineering smallness. And so there are a lot of PhD math professors that would never talk to their neighbor, right? They just gravitate towards their strength. And so what I want to suggest is that anxiety, it's brutal. I have struggled immensely with anxiety and have a story on that. It's brutal. And yet it's also a kind guide. It's a kind guide because there's something about conflict that's needing tended to in your story. And I'm sure that neighbor, it's not about him, but it's what's coming through him and what he elicits in you. And one even question, if we were engaging longer and more deeply, I would ask you, what age did you feel that same anxiety about confrontation? Or where were you when you first remember that same reaction in a situation of confrontation? And that's not something we can necessarily unpack fully here, but I'm just naming it to say that's your frontier. That's the edge of your initiation. Now, a guy listening to this might say, are you kidding? I can tell a guy to go to hell anytime I want. I'm always getting in fights and my wife's telling me to shut up. Well, that's not his frontier, right?
Right.
He actually needs to, repentance for him is not picking a fight, right? But he starts talking about the classroom and academics, and he gets really uncomfortable around you because you're one of those smart guys, right? And he puts a label on you, right? And so we all have our frontier. And in masculine initiation, that's one of the central questions we must hold for a boy or a man. What is my frontier? And that's where a walk with God and hearing his voice is so essential, because it's not a set of tips and it's not a set of tips and techniques. It's not a simple guidebook. We don't have an exhaustive set of rules or guidelines. We have a Father that's initiating us on a very personal and particular path.
Yeah. I will say, just reflecting on that, because I know we're almost up out of our time, and I do want to talk about your book a little bit, because I think you got some good stuff there. I think in that particular piece, just being open here, I think it began when I got married. Not because my wife causes me anxiety or anything, but now I'm in a position where I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a provider, I'm a protector, and I see it as part of my God-given duty to stand up for my family.
Yes.
Which puts me, by that very nature, in situations of confrontation.
Yes.
That situation with my neighbor, my wife was upset about some things, and I had to talk to him about it. I wasn't nasty about it, but I had to talk to him about it. There's been other things with different family relationships that I've had to confront things, because, as you know, when you get married, your whole context changes. When you begin to have children, your whole context changes. You're not just a son anymore. You are now a husband. You are now a father, and your whole relationship dynamic and structure changes.
Absolutely.
In very pivotal ways.
Yes. Well, I think it's brilliant, Patrick, because you're seeing clearly. Okay. You have eyes to see. And I think what I want to say is I'm so excited for you to dive into becoming a king, because you are speaking to the heartbeat of the dilemma. And I had spent 20 years unearthing, recovering this message and this path back to life to find kind of the resolution, the path and the process to restore the heart of a man from these ancient guides. And so I'm very excited for you to dive in, because fundamentally that shift happens if you go from young man to older man, where consequences stack up. You can no longer live sloppy when it comes to the life of your soul, right? Your margins evaporate. And what happens is your brokenness begins to surface. Mm-hmm. And that's not a bad thing. What it means is God is inviting you into more healing, more union, more real faith, not just a set of guidelines or rules, but an actual way of living that leads to life. And so that's really the message of becoming a king, is what is the most important thing? What is the path? What is the process? How do you become wholehearted? What does it look like? And I think what I want to say to you, Patrick, is I count you as a fellow apprentice. We are apprentices in kingdom living. And it's live ammo, right? The thing that with our wives is like, it's not like a football game where you can throw a flag and call a timeout. Like, she's always there. She's not going anywhere, right? It's the one place we can't hide. She sees your crap. Sherry sees my crap. But it's the place of the greatest potential for us to be healed and restored. And that's why in our household, what I've learned through so much failure and so many mistakes is the most important, powerful words. And now some of the most consistent words in our house are, I'm sorry, I was wrong. Will you forgive me?
Yeah.
I love you. To start there. But that has to come out of a heart being healed, not just trying to be a good guy. It has to come from a belief of, I'm under construction. I'm under renovation. It's in process, but with every stage of more healing, more deliverance, more freedom, we get more life and we get more joy.
And you are spot on with all of that, because I know that being married has revealed things in my spirit and in my character that need a lot of correction. Being a father has revealed a lot of things in me, particularly selfishness. And being married opens up the door, if you'll let it, to humility, because there's lots of times when I'm in the wrong and I have to say, I was wrong. Please forgive me. Or even if you weren't necessarily wrong, I still see it as my responsibility to try to restore the relationship, to reconcile.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying?
Yes. Right. It's bringing true strength and love.
Yes. Yes. So sometimes, even if you're right, you still have to swallow the pride in the fact that you were right for the greater good of your relationship, and to be reconciled, to say, hey, you know what, babe, let's figure this out.
Yes.
And make that first move, which is risky and hard.
Oh, it is.
In the frontier, as you call it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, one mentor said to me early in this process, he says, we have one of two choices, humility or humiliation, but there is not a third. So what would you like to choose, son? Right? And what I would, while we have this moment, Patrick, I just want to reflect something back to you, because part of that hearing from God is really just cultivating a spirit that's attuned to God's spirit. And that's something that I've just practiced for over 20 years, and it's bumpy and it's messy. But right now in my spirit, as we're engaging, what I'm sensing to share with you on your behalf is the Father's heart affirming you are on time. You are on time. You're on time in your marriage. You're on time in your work in the world. You are on time. And I have a sense that there might be even something in that he wants to speak to that's very personal that I'm not aware of, but some doubt or lie or false agreement that's wanted to get in there. And so I just want to speak that into your life for you to discern and see if that's from God or not. But I just sense to say to you as a brother, from a fathering heart of God, you're on time.
I appreciate that, Morgan. Very much so. And I think you're right in a lot of ways. And I know we're bumping up against time here. So before we have to completely hit stop, I want you to let us know how guys can get connected with you. We didn't get to talk a whole lot about your book, unfortunately, but your book is Becoming a King, The Path to Restoring the Heart of a Man. How can guys connect with you and get a hold of your book?
Yeah, I think what I would say is, if there's anything resonating in this podcast with men, there is much more in that message, because that message was the fruit of the sorts of things we're talking about over my last 20 years of being apprenticed alongside John and other like-hearted men. So becomingaking.com is the website for the book. The audiobook has some really cool added features where I gathered a circle of some of my closest allies that have consented to this path and process for over a decade. And they told stories like, what's it like? And then there's a study guide that's an in-depth process where I wrote it in a way to walk a person through this over time. If he really wants to excavate and look at the geography of his masculine soul. And then there's a video series of 6 parts that's just a great entry point where guys can watch them by themselves or with other guys to engage in these big ideas and begin the process. But Become Good Soil is the landing area for the blogs, the podcasts, and all of the apprenticeship that I've done and the events that we've offered for other men. So you can find lots more. But we're just getting started. But yeah, my hope is these men would pause even at the end of this podcast before they dive into everything else that's screaming for their attention, and just take 60 seconds and sit and tune their heart to the heart of God coming for them, and just risk saying, God, what's in this for me? What's the next step? What are you saying in this for me today?
Awesome, man. Yeah, I'll be sure to link all that up in the show notes. And for the sake of time, Morgan, we'll just end here. And I want to thank you so much for coming on the show today and sharing just this little snippet of all you have to share. I really appreciate it, man.
Yeah, you're welcome. Great to be with you, and proud of your guys out there that are going for it. It's worth it.
Right on, man. Thank you.
All right, gentlemen, that's all we have for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope our conversation was a blessing to you and that you leave this episode better equipped to be the man and the father God has called and created you to be. If so, then I ask that you please leave us a 5-star rating and a quick written review in iTunes. And make sure you head on over to the show notes to get all of the resources for this episode. While you're there, you can take part in our 5 days to be a better dad challenge, as well as get involved with our free Facebook community. All right, gentlemen, until next week, remember Proverbs 27:17. As iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. Stay sharp.